Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming to our monthly ICG Lab Talk series. It's a pleasure to have Tobias Scheck here. Tobias is a professor at Graz University of Technology. He did his PhD in 2001, finished his PhD in 2006 at University of Constance. He then moved to TU Darmstadt to become a junior research group leader as a postdoc, and then moved back to the University of Constance as an assistant professor, and his journey took him then to Graz, Austria, where he's now professor at the Institute for Computer Graphics and Knowledge Visualization. And Tobias is working on object retrieval and visual analytics. And we're looking forward to your talk, and it's great to have you here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Mark. Thank you all very much for being here today, for having me here. It's a pleasure to speak today in the ICG seminar. Thanks for inviting me, also Oliver. And yeah, as Mark has mentioned, I had several stations in my current work as a researcher, and what drives me since basically my PhD is the question: how can we make use of large, complex data sets by helping users to search what they are looking for and understand, for example, patterns in large data. And today I want to, and I'm specifically happy for this opportunity to show to you and to discuss with you some of our previous works that we have undertaken towards achieving these goals. And this is also, since I'm just new arrived in in Austria, this is also kind of an inaugural lecture for me to parts of the Austrian visual computing community. So yeah, so to begin with, what motivates our work is what basically motivates a lot of current work in computer science and data analysis. It's the emergence and availability of large amounts of complex data. Due to technical advances, we see a lot of complex data being available, for example, in biomedical techniques, biomedical analysis, genome data, mass screening, analysis of biological and medical compounds, for example, produces mass amounts of data. In finance and business, we do have, owing to sensor technology and high-speed trading networks, for example, in finance transactions, we have large volumes of stock data, financial market data. There is movement data, basically everywhere, ranging from GPS-enabled handheld devices due to up to tracking players, for example, during a soccer match, and trajectory data is becoming available. So the question is, what can we do with it? Spatial temporal data in general is arising due to, for example, open data initiatives where statistically collected data sets become available. Social media, it's another source of multifaceted data, including textual data, people tweeting about their activities, about their sentiments, but also spatial temporal data. And there is also visual data, for example, 3D object data, which becomes available due to advanced acquisition technology, for example, casual and professional 3D data acquisition. So the question, as we are confronted with such large and diverse data sets, is how can we make use of data? And basically, two very elementary tasks for helping users work with large data sets include searching and analyzing, right? So searching typically relates to finding specifically specified objects of interest in answering specific user queries. And then there is analysis, which typically focuses more on the overview type of data analysis, on a bird's eye perspective, where users want to make sense of groups of data, want to relate clusters of data, find relationships. And typically searching and analyzing, they are not only done in isolation, but typically in effective analysis systems, they are used in interchangeable cycles. So searching and analyzing are very important tasks to support in any information system. And now the question is also, why should we do it visually? And there are quite a number of existing systems so far that have demonstrated that it makes sense to also support the search and analysis process by means. And we can take a look back to classic systems such as Film Finder or Time Searcher by Ben Snyderman, where, for example, by visual means, people were enabled to specify patterns of interest, for example, a subset of a time series, and then search for such visually defined queries. And there are also ample examples for analysis tools, such as the classic Inspire system, which allowed to group and overview clusters of data in 2D, 2.5D information landscapes, for example, by exploiting clustering and projection techniques. And so besides these successful examples, I would say there is also conceptual evidence that using visual means can be very helpful in order to support direct object manipulation. And it may also leverage activation of background knowledge, inspire creativity, and in general support the information seeking goals of users. There is also evidence that, or from research, there is further evidence that specifically combining visualization data analysis can help to provide effective tools for data search and analysis. And in visual analytics, as a research area, we are interested in basically integrating two existing proven analysis stages or pipelines. On the one hand side, the automatic data analysis pipeline, which basically goes from data through computational models to knowledge, for example, by applying clustering and classification. And on the other hand, there is the visualization approach, basically going from data through visualizations to knowledge. And as has been outlined by Daniel Keim and others in the area, basically combining both visualization and analysis facilities can be very helpful to design systems that allow search and analyze and understand and make sense in large and complex data sets. Yeah, after a brief introduction, now I would like to discuss a number of research projects that we've been working on since in the last years, in which I want to outline where specifically how visualization approaches and data analysis approaches can be integrated to design systems that allow to search and analyze complex data. And I want to go basically through three areas and give some indications of how such systems can be designed. All right, starting with what we call search and research data. As another brief motivation, we can consider the fact that in many research domains, research data, scientific data, is acquired by scientific processes, and increasingly there is a notion of researchers and funding agencies wanting to preserve data which has been collected by scientific processes. So traditionally, the Earth observation and astronomy fields, for example, have been proponents and forerunners in the trend to make publicly available scientific data, which has been obtained from, for example, publicly funded large-scale experiments or observation efforts, like in astronometry, for example. So there are a number of such repositories which host research data, which are made accessible by metadata-based approaches. So for one example, on the top right, we see a search interface from the Oak Ridge DAAC repository, where users can search for Earth observation data sets by geographic location, by time, by scientists who obtained the data, for example. And this basically is an indication that there is infrastructure and there are massive data sets available. Other platforms exist, for example, like Pangea in Bremerhaven, which collects also data sets from the Earth observation realm. And but if we look at these systems, what they typically provide is metadata-based search. So basically, a researcher needs to have an idea from the keywords or the numeric, the metadata fields according to which to search. And on the other hand, if we go to the download section, if we access this data, in many cases it is transmitted, it is delivered in raw format, for example, in CSV tables. Of course, there exists some diagrammatic export tools in some of these platforms, but in generally there is basically a lot of these platforms providing raw data. So in our case, in a number of use cases, we asked ourselves, how can we enhance such scientific data repositories by visual interactive search methods for overviewing and for detailed searching? And within the WisInfo project, we collaborated with Technische Informationsbibliothek Hannover and others in order to craft such systems that can become a user-oriented layer to research repositories to help a visual exploration of research data. And in this info project, we basically considered two use cases, one of them being time-oriented data, time series data, and one of the approaches we followed in creating a visual design was to apply a clustering and projection method, in this case, the self-organizing map approach, which basically trains a neural network where the nodes are arranged on a regular grid. It's basically a competitive training process. Each cell represents a cluster, and neighboring clusters tend to also show similar cluster properties. So if we train such a network for temporal data, for time series data, by means of a specific feature vector or data representation, we can create such overviews like here, where we see for a larger data set of temporal data, where we see a number of cluster prototypes which give an overview about, in this case, temporal measurements of certain parameters that have been obtained at certain measurement stations across the globe. And it gives an overview about the general patterns that we see and also outliers. We can enhance such displays, also showing cluster properties, for example, by a opacity bands technique. We can also indicate which of these clusters are more crisp, which of these clusters are more blurry or fuzzy, meaning that the cluster prototype isn't kind of reflecting very well all the cluster members, which can be a starting point for an exploration of such a research data set. Of course, having a feature description or in general a similarity function for the different data items, we can also define visual search functions that allow to explore this data based on user query. For example, we can have an editor, as we see in the bottom right, where the scientist can specify a time progression or such a curve pattern and basically use this as a query to then go ahead and implement highlighting techniques which show where, in context of the overall data patterns that we see, the particularly searched data items can be found. And this can be also an interface, in a sense, to implement data-driven research tools, where, for example, a climate scientist could specify a certain temporal progression or some certain measurements, and then which correspond to a hypothesis about some climate properties. And then with this visual specification, you could go to the data set and find evidence for where such patterns have emerged previously. The second use case, and of course, scientific data sets in Earth observation, they are quite diverse. We have to build basically by a case-by-case base specific visualization and clustering or visual exploration techniques. As a second use case, we considered scatterplot data, which basically corresponds to measurements of two variables at the same time, which can be mapped as a point cloud in a typical scatterplot diagram. In case of multivariate observations, you have scatterplot matrices. And then again, we can ask the question, how can we provide overviews and detailed searches for retrieving patterns of interest in some larger scatterplot data space? As one, and in answering such questions, in implementing such search systems, what we typically need are effective similarity functions that allow to compare data elements for relevant properties. And one of the properties we experimented with was based on so-called regressional features that we tested. The idea behind regressional features was to take basically every scatter plot in the database and run against it a number of predefined regression models from a set of standard models, including, for example, linear, quadratic, cube-like, cubic models, and then recording the goodness of fit, which is the degree of precision by which each of these predefined models fits to any given scatter plot. If we record this goodness of fit, we basically get a descriptor which can be used to distinguish different data distributions. Here is a simple example giving two parabolas of different shape. The regressional feature vector here clearly peaks at the quadratic model, which we can use to distinguish these distributions from other distributions. And if we want to further distinguish between different shapes of parabolas within the class of quadratic data distributions, we can also resort, as we see on the right-hand side here, to the regression coefficient vector to append this basically to the feature vector in order to distinguish within this class of distributions. So again, basically what we need is a similarity function, and then we can go ahead and implement search and overview systems. One of the kind of straightforward applications of the similarity function is to implement query by example user search interfaces where a scientist, for example, may specify some dependency which the scientist is looking for. You could specify one measurement parameter like depth and leave the other one as a wildcard. And then with this query example, you can go to the database and retrieve measurements which correspond to this pattern and correspond to this specified query, and then possibly give insight into or give evidence for some hypothesis in the analysis process. Of course, such search systems often require and benefit from context. So in many of these research repository databases, we also have curated metadata, which we can use, for example, to put search results into geospatial context where they have been measured, and we can put them on a timeline. We can then, once we have a common data representation, like a specific feature vector for any of these diagrammatic data representations, we can also implement sketch-based systems where users can by means of a sketch-based tool, can specify the overall shape for such a data distribution and then retrieve patterns of interest. Here's a quick example of a prototype we implemented. User sketches a target data set or target distribution. Then we get a number of search results. We cluster these to show only groups of similar matches, and then have detail on demand facilities where users can go ahead and further compare and inspect in detail the found clusters and their individual similarities and differences among the data sets. So far some example on sketch-based search, which can also be extended by ideas we can borrow from web search engines, for example, in that what you typically have in a web search engine is such an auto-completion feature. You start typing a term, a keyword, and then the search system suggests to you frequently used or searched keywords. You can basically do the same in such a visual environment in that whenever the user finishes a stroke, at that very moment we can run a preliminary query against the data, retrieve some nearest neighbors, and then visualize this in a background layer, a so-called shadow drawing here in the background, a bit blurred to indicate that this is just a preliminary search result. It may not be what the final result would look like, but it can give already during querying, during sketch formulation, it can give some feedback to the user as to what kind of patterns are in the data and what to expect, and this can be used for further refinement of the queries. Okay, so This was a bit on visual interactive search in certain types of data, going through a visual representation. And the data analysis part in this was basically to implement similarity functions, feature extractions, which provide the similarity function. Now if you go a step further and ask ourselves, how can we further include users and interactive processes in the task of clustering data, grouping data for similarity, I want to outline one prototype which we implemented that connects with the self-organizing map approach, which I just mentioned, and makes this interactively steerable. To that end, let me start by describing first an application and a data scenario, and then outline how an interactive clustering tool could look like. So the data scenario here is temporal scatterplot data, or time-dependent scatterplot data, which arose from a research project we had together with financial data analysts who are interested in comparing assets over time, financial assets. And two of the main variables to describe financial assets include or volatility or risk and return. And typically, assets of certain risk classes are mapped in such a 2D data space for risk and return. And basically, when comparing data across time, basically every financial asset is a plot in this scatter plot, which moves through space in this diagrammatic representation. We can show such temporal changes by animation, of course. One can implement such a scatterplot analysis tool. Gapminder, for example, is one of the successful animated scatterplot visualization tools, we should point out. And if we draw trajectories, if we basically map the path that each of these points takes through the diagram space, we quite quickly end up with such cluttered hairball-like displays where there is a lot of overplotting of trajectories. So the question is, how can we reduce this amount of data which we get when considering animated scatterplot data? And one of the ideas, again, was to apply data reduction by means of the self-organizing map algorithm. What we basically did is to apply a segmentation, a custom segmentation scheme, which we see here in the bottom left-hand side of the figure, where we segmented basically each trajectory to 5 days of the trading week, basically from Monday through Friday, plotting the coordinate of each asset in a normalized XY space here, using the concatenated XY coordinates of this trajectory as a feature vector, and then running the self-organizing map algorithm, which is, in general, an unsupervised method in that it basically trains a self-organized display for the patterns, and this can give an overview about the different paths and patterns that individual trajectories take within this diagram space. We can go ahead on this data-reduced view and create specific analytical views like showing cluster memberships, cluster qualities by opacity bundle techniques like already introduced. We can basically apply filtering techniques, for example, based on such a self-organizing map-based display. We can highlight the map, all the patterns that occurred for a specific stock or a sector by highlighting. We can show cluster qualities, and we can also go to a temporal view in which we see here in the bottom right-hand side, where we map again every asset to a row in a table, where every column represents a typical trading week. And if we use this in a tabular view, we can end up, or we can generate views like these, which give basically an overview of all trading patterns of an index, of a certain financial index. And by applying a frequent pattern search techniques, we can identify weeks of the trading time which show a high number of similar movements or chart patterns. And here, for example, this was data from the 2007 financial crisis year, and the typical pattern we found here was that in one particular column there was a downturn, basically a crash in the market, which was then followed 2 weeks, which is indicated here by this blue column, which was then followed 2 weeks later by another column of yellow patterns, which basically indicated recovery movements later on. So again, this is basically one example for applying data reduction, for applying clustering to generate analytical displays that allow analysts to search for patterns of similar or of temporal progressions in some data space. We can apply overview techniques, we can apply detail techniques, but the underlying data analysis module, which was the self-organizing map algorithm, still was used in a black box kind of manner. We just applied it, generated the patterns, and then made use of it for visualization. So we asked ourselves, how can we make this a bit more interactive? How can we visualize how this learning method works, and how can we interact with it? In this case, it was rather straightforward because we already have a two-dimensional mapping of this, or kind of a regular data structure in this model, and we can interact with it by having the user sketch into certain cells some patterns which the user is basically interested in. We can fix these patterns and then just train or have the algorithm train the remaining empty cells around these manually fixed cells or patterns. The standard self-organizing map algorithm treats all cells as variables, but we can basically bring in background knowledge of users by some supervised constraints to the learning, for example, by fixing certain cells. And here's just an example how we can visualize this in a conceptual application. The user basically specified 2 fixed patterns. We show in a time-dependent plot how the patterns are emerged, how the patterns emerged during online training. And basically at any point in time during this training, the user would be able to push a pause button, readjust the basic structure, and then continue the training or rerun the training such that the final SOM, self-organizing map display, resembles what or resembles the patterns which users are familiar with. And an approach or an advantage for having such an involvement is that the user can basically fix the rough orientation of the clusters in the map, which supports the mental mapping. If we apply the algorithm in an unsupervised way, basically the layout of patterns can change on every new run, and here by having fixed points and interactive training, users can arrive at more stable layouts if they wish. Yeah, so this was one project where we asked the question, how can we integrate better visualization and machine learning by having the user directly exposed to the training process by means of visual anchors, basically, to work with the algorithm. Now I would like to come to a third example of problems where we think that we can successfully combine data analysis methods and visualization methods for helping users find relevant data of interest in some larger data space. I want to call it learning patterns in high-dimensional spaces, and it deals basically with the question, how can we make sense of high-dimensional or multivariate data, which basically can lead to many different data views, out of which only a few may be relevant. So if we consider a typical table, a relational database, which typically has observations in the rows, for example, subjects of study, for example, inhabitants, or in a person database, we may collect, for example, attributes relating to the health of users, like age and blood pressure. We may have attributes that relate to lifestyle and life quality, such as traveling frequency, for example, and income. So these would be two subspaces out of a larger relational table, and basically each view, each subspace, gives specific insight or can lead to patterns that we may find in these subspaces. For example, we may find a grouping in the traveling subspace. Maybe we find 3 clusters in the traveling subspace, and we find another 3 clusters in the health subspace, which may or may not be similar to each other. They may have the same members, they may have intermixed members. Both of these findings could be relevant, but yeah, there may be several of such patterns, and how can we basically support the user in searching for subsets of data that make sense, that can be interpreted. This is basically a challenging question in general for high-dimensional data analysis and high-dimensional data visualization. And the basic problem basically is continued and spans through many different visualization techniques. For example, if I have a large scatter plot matrix, which of these 2-dimensional subspaces is relevant? Where are the relevant patterns that we see? Some may be relevant as green, marked as green, others may be irrelevant. In parallel coordinates, we can have many different permutations of the dimensions. Some of them may be insightful, others not. We may have temporal data, we may have geospatial data, and depending on the mapping, depending on the view generation, these techniques or these views may be interesting, may be relevant, or may be irrelevant. So how can we support the searching for interesting or relevant subspaces basically in an exploding search space? So the more dimensions we have, the many more different views we may have, the many more different subspaces we have. And also if we consider the visualization pipeline, where we can set different parameters for generating views, basically the same applies. Not every view is relevant. There are many views, and we somehow want to help the users to more quickly arrive at views of interest. One approach to help is to apply subspace search methods. So in machine learning, subspace search algorithms like the surfing method that we studied in one project here, it basically helps you to find, to generate a number of candidate subspaces based on some heuristic quality criterion, like cluster quality that is in the given subspace. So we can readily apply such subspace search methods in order to generate subspaces of interest. However, these are often redundant and also hard to interpret. In the experiments we did with surfing, we found that it produced quite a number of similar and redundant subspaces, often hundreds or thousands of subspaces, basically based on a iterative search where it gradually builds larger subspaces from smaller subspaces, and in general it may quickly lead to a large number of subspaces. So we basically designed a workflow that was aimed at reducing and navigating a large number of subspaces, which basically starts, if we follow this pipeline, to apply a subspace search method, which gives typically a large number of subspaces. And then we apply clustering and data reduction on the set of subspaces together with interactive searching to make use of subspace search approaches. So I just want to show the basic tool that we developed to this end. It's at its core, it's basically built around the idea of computing a similarity between each subspace and then applying MDS to map each subspaces as a subspace thumbnail to a 2-dimensional projection and navigate this. The similarity function here is formed by a combined distance function, which takes into account topologic similarity of the subspaces with respect to the location of data points. And as another component, we use the overlap of dimensions. That is an intersection, a measure for the for the fraction of intersecting dimensions, which are members in in pairs of subspaces. So in general, we can use such tools which basically follow the same idea: visual data representation, visual data reduction by means of clustering and projection of subspaces, together with detail-on-demand tools like parallel coordinates and selection tools. And with such a tool, one can formulate also queries for pairs of subspaces which may be relevant for a given application. For example, because the data topology may be similar, so data points may be similar into subspaces with respect to their pairwise distances. That could be combined with a search for the subspaces themselves not being similar with respect to having a different number or different types of dimensions. So that would be an interesting, possibly an interesting finding, if we had two subspaces with a different data topology, but different with the same data topology but different data attributes. Could be interesting, for example, for customer segmentation and customer relationship marketing, or in general finding interesting groupings that can be meaningfully interpreted and successively visualized. So, for example, by denoting group memberships and comparing these across different subspaces. So one approach here was to apply subspace search methods, and recently we also took a look into a second kind of line of work in order to help users converge more quickly to interesting findings or potentially meaningful findings by applying an idea which has been around for quite a while, mainly in information retrieval, which is relevance feedback. In information search, in information retrieval, relevance feedback basically allows users to mark or to denote items of interest, documents typically, as being relevant or irrelevant, and then you train a classifier that distinguishes previously unseen elements with respect to a provided user classification. And we basically have the idea to apply such relevance feedback mechanisms also to the question of finding or learning what characterizes interesting views. So if we consider a large scatter plot data space, we have many hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands possibly of scatter plots. And how can we basically support relevance feedback by allowing users to indicate relevant and irrelevant scatter plots? How many, and also how many, the question is how many samples should we give? And then how can we implement relevance feedback? We basically modeled here a framework or a process model how relevance feedback systems can be implemented for visual data exploration, which basically starts here on the low left-hand side with the data set of interest. Could be basically any data set. We focused for the time being on multidimensional data. We basically map each data element to a diagram. So basically we pick a visualization for each data object, in our case here, scatter plots. We then again should, like in the previous examples which I mentioned, we need to specify a similarity function or a feature vector that is then input to a classification scheme. In our case, which is focused on scatter plots, we chose the well-known agnostics features, which are a number of graph theoretic measures that describe certain properties of the point clouds in the scatter plots, such as stringiness, clumpiness, or other interpretable features. Basically, we also need to decide how we do the sampling. So in a very large space of candidate views, we cannot show all of the relevant or all of the data views to a user. We should do some sampling to pick images to show to users in order to ask feedback. We basically need to decide how do we implement the feedback stage. Do we have active feedback by having the user mark relevance or irrelevance? How do we score this? Do we have a scoring scheme? Or do we want to go for indirect approaches? For example, using eye tracking, which is one idea one could look into, or some other measures of implicit relevance. And then Finally, we need a model learner, which makes use of the provided relevance data and then classifies unseen data as, or views as being relevant or irrelevant. We implemented a test system which basically follows or implements this pipeline. It's just the first implementation. We really haven't extensively evaluated it yet. It's basically a framework for us to test different data types, different views, different features. And the basic functionality involves annotating scatter plots as being relevant and irrelevant. We use diagnostics features and with decision tree classifier, which is incrementally learned from the provided relevance feedback, and which is also visualized as a meta visualization, which basically shows the decision tree structure, namely the sequence of attributes which is used to partition relevant and irrelevant data. And our idea is that by this kind of meta visualization, the expert may also learn why certain parts of the data are relevant to the expert by considering the hierarchy of features, which basically gives us certain feature selection, and which can be interesting to learn as well. And of course, such a tool can benefit from additional data views, like showing histograms of the diagnostics features, which emerge when I narrow down my search space. Yeah, so as I mentioned, this is kind of first work in this direction. So we have a concept, we have some test implementation, but in ongoing work we consider more features, more data types, and of course how to evaluate the effectiveness of relevance feedback, the user acceptance, and the convergence of this process. This is kind of an interesting problem to consider. Okay, finally some words on evaluation. So what do we do here to this extent? Of course, evaluation is important. It's highly important to assess how effective our visual analytics systems are that we create. And some more recent approaches to evaluation include contest and crowdsourced evaluation. And with respect to contest evaluation, I just may briefly mention the VAST challenge introduced by Gene Scholz, Mark Whiting, and colleagues, which basically on a yearly basis presents a data set of interest with some ground truth, which is of course not published at the time of the contest. And then the community is asked to generate or to provide visual analytics systems, create reports about their findings, and then an expert panel is assembled to judge the submissions. And thereby we have a sort of end-oriented evaluation with respect to kind of an experimental evaluation, which may be a way to go for visual analytics systems, because as also the organizers here state in the paper, visual analysis systems are not straightforward to evaluate because they assemble typically different components. They merge or they integrate information visualization techniques, data analysis techniques, interaction techniques, analytical reasoning tasks, which go beyond time and error, basically. And so the VAST challenge provides a forum for that. Yeah, one particularly, as I found nice challenge was the 2013 Internet Movie Database Challenge, where the task was to implement a visual prediction system, where you had to predict the user ratings and the box office results of movies that were to start over the weekend. And you had to submit the prediction results in advance, of course, and later on you had the empirical data from IMDb to compare against, and then compare how different visual prediction systems work based on empiric data. Thanks to students at University of Constance, we were able to implement two different approaches to this challenge and submit results. One of the approaches, which you see here on the left-hand side, was visual interactive oriented. It's basically a mind map where the predictors could select similar training samples, similar historic movies based on similarity of genre, of actors, and a couple of selection techniques like actor co-occurrence matrices helped. And basically, this data was gathered in a mind map, basically the training data, and in the end we applied a nearest neighbor classifier which generated a weighted sum of values to predict star rating and box office. On the other hand, we had a more machine learning type system where a number of neural network classifiers were trained, and then by the interaction was basically restricted to selecting training data and setting weights for fusing the predictions of the individual models. And yeah, just to give some results, quantitative comparison, we basically had a number of predictions for a series of movies, and on average we kind of obtained an average error of 0.55 stars, which out of 10 I think is a reasonable prediction result. And one can analyze also why certain movies were quite hard to predict, like here The Heat or RIPD. And so far we really what we have here is a quantitative measure for the quality of such approaches. However, the analysis as to why the results are this good go much further. For example, if you have a team of analysts working with such tools, there is group communication, there is teamwork going on, and some work that we have discussed today on provenance analysis would be very interesting to gather, to post-analyze how experts use such tools and where such tools can help in the prediction. Yeah, another vast challenge, 2011. I found also very interesting among other challenges, where the goal was to have a system to analyze spatial temporal data by means of a tweet data set, which can be visualized in space and in context. And so in general, the vast challenge, I think it's one line of evaluation that we are following. Just to mention briefly, the second line of evaluation is crowdsourced approaches, which have recently come into interest, where you can use Mechanical Turk to define a number of experiments which are done on the web, and then you gather statistics for these experiments. And in a recent paper, we implemented a test which basically aimed to answer the question, what are effective text highlighting techniques? Very simple visualization question, basically text visualization by highlighting using typesetting, like background, coloring, font size, underlying certain typesetting operations. And based on a Mechanical Turk study, we found out we could compile a ranking of such typeset operations, where kind of not unexpectedly, but the font size ranked best, followed by applying borders, background highlighting, typesetting in red text color, bold typeface, etc. So this is an example for also evaluation that probably is more applicable to the low-level tasks, which can be kind of formulated in simple short-run experiments to gather statistical feedback. And so still a challenge is how we can leverage such crowd-based approaches to evaluate the effectiveness of more analytical tools, which work over longer periods of time and which include several different sub-analysis steps. Okay, let me outline just a number of challenges we see in this area and that we want to continue working in the future on. And they basically relate to the projects I introduced. On the first area, we want to basically continue the design of visual analysis and search tools for research data exploration, helping scientists to make use of scientific data repositories which are available And so far, we defined similarity functions and visualizations based on the raw data directly. However, if we go back to Jim Gray's vision of the fourth paradigm of data-driven research, we should take into account much more than the raw data. Of course, experimental setups, scientific papers which describe methodologies and experimental conditions and conclusions about and conclusions that have been drawn from certain data sets, they all should be taken into account into a scientific data exploration system. And to that end, it would be very interesting to try to relate patterns in the raw data with textual descriptions or even or diagrammatic representations we find in belonging scientific publications of authors who also published the data, and kind of bringing this more together would be very interesting, I guess, for designing novel scientific data retrieval systems. Regarding the second prototype, interactive clustering, the topic of model visualization for visual analytics, I think still poses a number of questions. So if we want to really tightly integrate data visualization and machine learning, we basically I assume we need models, we need visualization models that map the machine learning models to the visual space, such that users can track and interact with these models. Some models, we know how to visualize them. For example, decision trees have been studied in some works. They are quite straightforward to apply, at least if they are not too large. On the other hand side, there are more other models which are quite hard to visualize. For example, think about a multi-layer neural network, many nodes, many links, different activations, different weights of the links. This is kind of a hard problem, and I wouldn't know how to integrate this in a straightforward way into a visual analytics system that would allow to steer the training of a neural network, for example. And so in general, the question, I think, is what models can we visualize, and what more can we do to visualize models which are currently not supported. Finally, relevance feedback for visual analysis. As I already mentioned, we really haven't in-depth evaluated our approach. Certainly, there are many questions we can ask with respect to implementing visual relevance feedback tools. So how many iterations do we need? What features do we use? How can we train classifiers? And how do we evaluate what is actually relevant? And how can we assess this? I think more should be done here, and in particular with respect to indirect acquisition approaches, we can do more. Finally, I want to mention also another research area we are working in, which deals with searching. I haven't talked today about 3D object retrieval, which is also research of interest to us, which deals with computing similarity functions for different for 3D to implement sketch-based and example-based systems. And also recently we looked into methods to compute symmetries for restoring incomplete objects based on local features. And also all these approaches basically in 3D shape analysis based on features require definitions of similarity functions, which are often abstract in nature. 3D features, there are plenty of different feature definitions, feature extractors to compute similarity for 3D shapes on global and partial level. It would be very interesting to ask how we can support the user more directly in specifying what is similar, what is relevant in a 3D shape database, and how can we learn, for example, which notion of symmetry is relevant or not, because automatic symmetry computation can only suggest symmetry planes. It may fail in cases, and how can the user, for example, train such symmetry detection? Would be another question of research. Okay, so to conclude, I aimed at giving an overview about search and analysis systems or problems that make use of visual representations of data that help users to retrieve objects of similar nature based on feature-based similarity functions. There are many applications, I think, for example-based and sketch-based searching. And I also talked about the problem of learning relevance. I think with growing data sizes, we need to help users to find patterns of interest more efficiently. And recent work in the area of visual interest functions, heuristics that kind of assess the information content in any visualization. Such lines of research can help, I would, to guide the user better to large search spaces. And of course, evaluation is important. And some of the approaches include content and cloud-based evaluation. With that, thank you very much for your kind attention. I want to acknowledge our collaborators and students who implemented many of these systems I showed today, and acknowledge our project partners. And thanks once more for the kind invitation, and I'm looking forward to any questions if you have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We have time for a couple of questions. Who wants to go first? Alexander?
So the relevance feedback is only yes and no. So this looks good to me, and this doesn't interest me at all. So from only yes and no, you have to, I think, decide on the parameters of your classifier. Is that right?
Yes. So far we support binary relevance, yes or no, as you mentioned. We basically have two classes in which all of the objects fall, positive and negative, and then we train a position tree classifier to mimic, kind of, or to reflect this training data as it is provided. It's of course a limitation. So conceptually, there are many more shades of relevance, basically. So we could apply numeric scores to have different relevance classes, like maybe strongly relevant, weakly relevant also. But this may kind of pose interactive burdens on the user in order to kind of distinguish different notions or different levels of relevance. This may be something which may not be feasible in practice because of user acceptance. Some studies in relevance feedback from text retrieval, document retrieval, indicate that users are quite reluctant to use such techniques, so we must be kind of very minimally invasive. Maybe one approach to add here would be to have a visual placement approach where users could drag and drop objects in a view plane and indicate relevance by similarity, for example, and then learn similarity model from such 2D arrangements.
And how do you decide? How I understood it is you have a scatter plot, and you say this looks interesting to me. But how do you know what was interesting? You have, for example, the user finds it is interesting because there's a clear linear separation, just a straight line between two clusters in the plot. But another one would probably say, okay, I have this decision boundary that is not a linear separation, but it's a circle or something else, or it has a large area, and the other one says, okay, I have a small area. So how do you know which other user shows this certain plot to be relevant?
That's a very, very good question. So in order to come up to better specify what is relevant in the post-analysis phase. So far, we treat the classification as a black box as well. I mean, we have features extracted, agnostics features, and we just feed this together with the training samples to the decision tree. And in the end, we get a classification of relevant and irrelevant for any unseen object. We experimented with some of these visualizations you saw on the right-hand side. They included a histogram of the contained diagnostics Like they give interpretable measures for stringiness, clumpiness, etc. of the data. But so far we weren't really successful to interpret these. We often had a mix of different features in both relevant and irrelevant classes. And I tend to think there is still a semantic gap between the low-level output of the classifier and the interpretation as to what is relevant. Indeed, we may need higher-level tools where the user could, for example, annotate certain parts, clusters in scatterplot, or draw some lines or separation planes, which kind of would give a more rich feedback channel to show what is relevant, what irrelevant. Some of the tools in process analysis, tolerance tracking may help. For example, in the tool we discussed where the user can online enter annotations to data view, that could be also constitute input to do classification later on and interpret also why things are relevant. So far it's, I should say it's a first approach, and we would need to do more experimentation.
Further questions?
You showed the visualization for finance data, and I'd like to know how scalable this is, because you had a lot of small multiples of the different companies, I guess, and you highlighted which one is a downtrend and uptrend, but have you tried up to how much companies does it scale, or this approach?
Yeah, this is indeed the go-to first. Kind of visually, it was a test case, and we haven't formally evaluated how effective it is. Of course, going to such glyph representations, you lose a lot of information. So in such a display, it's not even possible to use color coding to show the start and end point of trajectories. So certainly a lot of information is lost, and one needs detailed views to further analyze these patterns. I have no good answer for this, other than kind of support different levels of aggregation in order to implement zooming and overview first techniques. The basic idea was a bit to mimic what technical analysts often go for in time series analysis. They typically look for, like in technical chart analysis, you have these different patterns like double peak formations and moving average shapes and projections of averages of different scale. And so the hope was here to have such a typology of automatically compute a typology of patterns in not line chart space, but in scatter plot space, right, to some extent. And also, we didn't really do evaluation here with the final prototype, which would have been interesting to look into.
Okay, we have time for one final question. I have a quick question. So you talked about finding patterns in temporal data. How can you find patterns on different granularities? So as you know, the user could sketch a peak, and this peak could be a whole month or could be 1 second in your data set. How do you get this?
Yeah, that's another good question, which is basically I did hide some of the search space size also here, because you may search on different levels of temporal resolution. We applied often some segmentation schemes, which basically fixed temporal scale, time series cluster. We have segmentation for daily patterns, for 24 hours of a day, which are granule, which are interpretable, which were kind of taken from our discussions with Earth observation scientists. But in another application, you may have a pattern over 1 month, or sometimes even the question is defined what is the right periodicity of pattern looking for. And I mean, technically, what you could do is just automatically do a segmentation with sliding windows of different sizes, pyramids of different segmentations. Then probably would need another overview visualization that shows patterns in different granularities, and basically stack on top of another overview layer, besides techniques that would do automatic interest point detection or automatic segmentation. So, we also haven't looked into many of the time series analysis methods that do segmentation or these. I mean, there are a lot of algorithms we could use to possibly test.
Okay, thank you. This brings us to the end of our seminar. I want to announce the next seminar, which will be on the 19th of January. It will be given by Nasir Nawab. Professor Nasir Nawab is at TU Munich. And he's going to talk about aided medical procedures. This will be very interesting for sure, and you're all very welcome to join us again. Let's thank Tobias again.
Thank you very much.